All right, welcome back. We're now on Chapter 11, The Americans, Section 4, entitled The North Takes Charge. A little windy out here, so it's taking the computer longer to load. I know that has nothing to do with it whatsoever, but I thought I would throw that out there. Chapter 11, Section 4, The North Takes Charge. Key victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg helped the Union wear down the Confederacy. Most wars have turning points. A lot of people say the war in the Napoleonic Wars was the Battle of Moscow. I think you can also say probably the turning point of the U.S. Civil War was either Gettysburg or Vicksburg, and they happened at about the same time, one in the West and one in the East. Stonewall Jackson was a brilliant leader for the Confederacy. A lot we talked about earlier at night with uniforms, sometimes it was hard to tell the difference between who was on what side. And Stonewall Jackson was accidentally shot and eventually died of his wounds by his own troops while he was on patrol. This would be a huge blow to the South. So Lee decided to invade the North and pushes into Pennsylvania. We did that mainly looking for supplies, but also to scare the North a little bit. He went through Maryland into Pennsylvania, and he ran into the Union Army at a town called Gettysburg from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863. And it was the most decisive battle of the war. While Antietam was the bloodiest one day of the war, Gettysburg would be the bloodiest overall battle. The Union forces win after 3 days of intense fighting. The total casualties was 30%, meaning 1 in 3 pretty much of every soldier that fought in that battle was either wounded severely or killed. 23,000 killed or wounded on the Union side and 28 on the Confederate side. Lee gives up hope of invading the North, and the Confederacy would never recover from this battle. While this is going on, in Vicksburg, Grant continues the Western campaign. Vicksburg, Mississippi guarded the Mississippi River, and Grant knew that if he took over Vicksburg, then he would have control of the Mississippi. The Confederate, basically, they laid siege to Mississippi. They laid siege to Vicksburg and also shot cannons into it, bombarded it, and eventually the Confederates surrendered the city. This successfully cut the Confederacy in two, which goes back to General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. We're not going to go over the Gettysburg Address here, but the Gettysburg Address is one of Abraham Lincoln's most famous speeches, if not the most famous speech. And he talks about healing, he talks about the war and the struggle, and we'll do an activity in class over the Gettysburg Address. After Gettysburg and Vicksburg, people all over the South began to openly call for an end to the war, trying to negotiate a peace. Soldiers began to desert. The Confederate government was ineffective, mainly because the government itself, if you remember, was a confederacy. It was not a federation. So the states were technically sovereign. So many state governments refused assistance or refused to give assistance to the Confederacy. Lincoln appointed Grant as commander of all Union forces in 1864, and he appointed William Tecumseh Sherman as commander of the Western forces. Both men believe in what's known as total war, which is fighting not only the armies and government, but also the citizens, burning down towns, destroying railroad tracks, all the above. In June of 1864, May to June of 1864, Grant loses 60,000 men and Lee only loses 30,000. But the problem was the Union could replace those while the South had nothing to replace it with. Sherman marched southeast through Georgia, creating a path of total destruction, burning down pretty much every building in its path. Rome, Georgia, for instance, was almost completely laid to waste. Atlanta was burned to the ground, and he set out toward the coast. Sherman's troops turned north to meet up with Grant. Behind were 25,000 slaves seeking freedom. Here's a picture of Sherman's march. Sherman is one of the more hated generals in the South during this time period. They hated him because of the fact that he didn't just fight troops. Now, they didn't massacre civilians or anything like that, but they did destroy uh, churches, hospitals, everything. On March 1865, it's clear the end of the Confederacy is near. Grant was approaching Richmond, Virginia from the west. Sherman was approaching Richmond from the south, and the Union can replace all the troops that are being lost while the South cannot. President Jefferson Davis and his government leave the capital. Lee and Grant meet to arrange Confederate surrender and courthouse in the Virginia village of Appomattox Courthouse. The actual slide says Appomattox. The name of the town was Appomattox Courthouse. We need to make sure that's accurate. April the 9th, 1865, the Civil War ends. I had the privilege of going to Appomattox when I was in the 4th or 5th grade, Appomattox Courthouse. It's really a neat situation where you see how they kept that house steady. And also, it's important to note that Grant treated the Confederates with dignity. He allowed Lee arrived in full dress uniform. They had a sit down with basically like two leaders of armies, not a rebellion gone bad. And Lee and Grant allowed the soldiers not to be taken prisoner. This was technically not the end of the war. There were some other troops still out there fighting, but most would eventually lay down their arms. The last section is Section 5, the legacy of the war. The Civil War, of course, settled the long-standing disputes over states' rights and slavery. From this point on, there would be no doubt that the federal government was in charge and that slavery was illegal. The federal government now, there was no doubt, held supreme power. It was no longer secession was ever discussed. States' rights weakened, but does not disappear, and it will pop up again during the Civil Rights era. Income tax, paper currency, conscription made the federal government directly involved in people's lives. After the war, especially in the North, industry increased and a national railroad system was built. The South was a devastated landscape, and so it's going to be a little bit different in the South, and they're going to go through Reconstruction, which we'll talk about next chapter. But the National Bank Act sets up a series of federal banks. Northern industry increased, and large-scale agriculture begins. The war destroyed the Southern slave-based economy, and Sherman's march wiped out the economic potential for decades. So basically, the South is going to be dependent for 20 or 30 years. There was a great human cost to the war. Over 360,000 Union soldiers versus 275,000 Confederate soldiers died. Over 500,000. Also, close to 500,000 were wounded as well. 2.4 million men served in the war. Lives were disrupted. Unions and the Confederacy spent $3.3 total billion, twice what the government had spent the previous 80 years. War debt and veterans' pensions consumed federal budget for decades, and this is going to be huge. The Southern war debt would never be paid. It was part of the conditions for them to return to the Union was that they would have to basically bankrupt on their debt. The Emancipation Proclamation had only freed slavery in the states that seceded. What about the border states where slavery was still legal? Well, the 13th Amendment passed, and the 13th Amendment basically said that slavery was no longer in existence. Neither slavery nor voluntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime wherein the penalty shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. The movie Lincoln basically bases itself upon his fight to get the 13th Amendment passed. On April 14, 1865, 4 days after Lee surrendered, Lincoln and his wife went to Ford's Theater in Washington to see a comedic play called Our American Cousin. John Wilkes Booth was a 26-year-old actor and Southern sympathizer, shot Lincoln in the back of the head and jumps from the balcony to the stage. He breaks his leg and shouts, Sic semper tyrannis, which means death to tyrants. This is supposedly what Brutus said when he stabbed Caesar. The South has been avenged. Booth escapes the theater and is caught by Union troops in a Virginia barn and shot. Lincoln's funeral train travels for 14 days from D.C. to his hometown in Springfield, Illinois. 7 million people view the funeral procession.